Congressman Maxine Waters believed she could openly embarrass Senator John Kennedy with a solitary jab, yet his deeply rational, evidence-based counter-argument methodically unraveled her 35-year career in politics right in front of her, rendering her utterly mute. This incident took place on the 18th of June, 2025, inside room 2128 of the Rayburn House Office Building. The House Financial Services Committee had convened for a planned session focused on banking oversight and the defense of consumers. This setting was precisely the kind of legislative arena that Waters had practically dominated for the better part of 2 decades. It acted as her personal territory, her dedicated panel, and her platform to control. Moreover, the individual she summoned from the Senate to testify, Louisiana Senator John Neely Kennedy, was someone she considered a simple punchline instead of a formidable political rival. Assuming her role as the leading member, Waters displayed the distinct attitude of a lawmaker who had exercised total power in that chamber since long before many junior aides had even started law school. Her iconic headband rested immaculately on her head, her spectacles were positioned perfectly, and she adopted the severe look of a school administrator eager to ensure a disciplinary encounter was as agonizing and short as could be. Kennedy rested peacefully at the witness desk, wearing his traditional seersucker outfit paired with a crooked necktie. Positioned ahead of him were merely a standard yellow writing tablet and an unusually slender manila envelope. The folder's narrow thickness implied an individual who had thrown out all meaningless trivia, carrying only solid, indisputable evidence. Waters initiated the dialogue without demonstrating any trace of common courtesy. Senator Kennedy, she stated, enunciating his rank with a scornful inflection typically saved for individuals she considered completely beneath her attention. I didn't summon you to this chamber to execute your little comedy act for the press. This is a solemn committee regarding financial supervision, not a humor program transmitted from the swamps. She shifted her stare from Kennedy toward her fellow committee members, keenly cognizant that a public slight carries more weight when presented to onlookers. If you have pertinent statistics concerning consumer protection, disclose them. If you merely arrive to weave rustic tales regarding your imaginary buddy Boudreaux, there is an entertainment venue on K Street that would gladly accept you. She halted, not for dramatic impact, but to establish her supremacy. It represented the quietness of a boss controlling the precise pace of the space. And to be honest, Senator, I have committed my entire existence to this endeavor. I have fought for destitute neighborhoods forsaken by massive corporate banks, championed African-American property ownership, and fought exploitative borrowing for 3.5 decades, 35 years, well before you comprehended the workings of a congressional committee. So kindly save your rural performance for someone else. The whole chamber paused in anticipation. The newly elected lawmakers, the policy assistants, and the journalists all observed intently. Everyone expected that Kennedy would react in his standard fashion, deliver a clever retort, share an endearing tale, and seamlessly transition forward. That represented his usual modus operandi, yet Kennedy merely accessed his jacket pocket to retrieve his reading spectacles. Acting with intentionally unhurried and precise motions, he wiped the glass, placed them on his visage, unsealed the slender document file, and gazed upward. Madam Ranking Member Kennedy commenced, his southern accent flowing out as dense and leisurely as cold molasses. I genuinely value that thorough recounting of your background. 35 years is certainly spectacular because it constitutes an incredibly extended duration to serve as the lawmaker for the very same region. He looked down at his documents and then directly back into the eyes of Waters. It also constitutes an astonishingly extensive time frame for absolutely nothing to alter. Therefore, assuming your consent, I will guide you through exactly what those 3.5 decades resemble when we focus exclusively on the statistics. Waters squinted marginally, exposing the subtle flinch of a seasoned lawmaker detecting that the power balance had suddenly changed. Let us commence with a relatively minor issue, Kennedy remarked, even though his inflection guaranteed that nothing concerning this exchange would actually be minor. The Maxine Waters Employment Preparation Center bears your personal moniker and was financed by a targeted funding provision you individually demanded. The oversight organization Citizens Against Government Waste actually bestowed the Porker of the Month designation upon you for that precise endeavor in June of 2009, while Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington added you to their registry of the most unethical lawmakers in the Capitol for a fifth straight time due to it. He padded his file. Naturally, those are simply opinionated perspectives, yet I am an individual who favors concrete truths, so I requested my staff to extract the formal data from the Department of Labor, and here is precisely how your record appears in reality. In 2024, the Maxine Waters Employment Preparation Center boastfully declared that 340 individuals completed their curriculum. He allowed the figure to linger. 340 appears like a respectable accomplishment up until you review the subsequent sentence in the document, which states that the employment success rate a half year after finishing was precisely 11 people, 11 out of a cohort of 340. Kennedy let the crushing figure penetrate the silent chamber. Subsequently, utilizing the expert pacing he had perfected over numerous capital inquiries, he shifted focus. My dear buddy Boudreaux manages a modest catfish enclosure down in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. Each and every spring, he populates this water with 200 juvenile fish, and their survival metric is 94%, indicating that 188 of the 200 catfish effectively mature from small hatchlings into large, consumable fish. Madam Ranking Member, the aquatic life in Boudreaux's rear property boasts a substantially greater success metric than your heavily subsidized employment education facility. He removed his spectacles to polish them anew as the chamber started to sense the cadence of his dismantling. Keep in mind, Boudreaux possesses no state-sponsored structure carrying his moniker, and he lacks a gigantic metallic sign labeling it the Boudreaux Center for World-Class Aquaculture Excellence. He simply refers to it as the pond. Yet 94% of his yield lives, because when an individual is genuinely executing the strenuous labor rising in the frigid darkness at 5 a.m, carrying hefty sacks of nourishment, continuously verifying the liquid warmth, and removing the deceased ones before they contaminate the robust ones, an individual doesn't require their title slapped onto a surface. Your enduring impact is evident in the fish. He glared directly at Waters. Your identity is branded in massive characters across the facade of an institution possessing a 3.2% triumph rate, whereas Boudreaux's impact breathes inside 188 swimming catfish, and I shall allow the citizens of America to determine which of those genuinely represents occupational preparedness. A clear ripple of chuckles moved across the space, prompting Waters to release a brief, abrupt laugh. It was not authentic entertainment, but instead the guarded mock of a politician who had endured decades of corruption, investigations, and reprimand efforts, a figurehead who genuinely thought an individual wearing a seersucker outfit recounting angling fables presented literally zero danger to her domain. It was a chuckle that quietly conveyed, "Is that the greatest attack you possess?" Kennedy turned to the subsequent sheet on his yellow notepad. The crowd appeared slightly entertained, yet Kennedy remained completely solemn. "We shall redirect our attention to property, Madam Ranking Member, specifically your own," he stated meticulously from his papers. "Your principal, everyday home is situated in the exceptionally wealthy Hancock Park district of Los Angeles, claiming an approximate market worth of $6 million, spanning 6,000 square feet of residential area, and containing a personalized indoor swimming facility. It is guarded by thick iron barricades on its entries, immense barriers spanning its extensive driveways, and defensive enclosures securing the secluded patios, coupled with pristine, manicured grounds tended by a costly external workforce because, in your vicinity, the vegetation itself possesses employees. Your closest neighbors consist of stars such as vocalist Chris Brown and the historic mansion constructed by the billionaire petroleum magnate J. Paul Getty." He flipped the paper, the quietness intensifying within the anxious space. Presently, we will examine your legitimate congressional zone, California's 43rd, situated within South Central Los Angeles. It represents a totally distinct universe operating in a completely different paradigm. He vocalized the metrics with the clinical objectivity of a physician delivering a fatal prognosis. The existing impoverishment metric rests at 27%, indicating 1 out of every 3 youths within your zone is residing beneath the national poverty threshold, amounting to 161,000 citizens caught in adversity. They similarly possess metallic bars on their glass panes. Yet conversely to your ornamental iron fences, theirs serve for fundamental existence. They constitute the type of obstacles that yell, "This community is perilous, and I lack the funds to flee from it." The aggressive crime statistic in your zone is 40% greater than the countrywide standard, whereas African American property ownership has consistently dropped each and every year throughout the preceding 10 years. The profound institutionalized wounds originating from the 1,992 unrest, an incident you openly termed a rebellion, and which led to 63 fatalities inside your parameters, remain glaringly apparent across the architecture. And within the demographic statistics, 33 years subsequently. Kennedy glanced upward, locking eyes with her once more. Your $6 million estate isn't even situated inside the boundaries of the zone you champion. It formerly was, yet the perimeters were later modified in an advantageous manner. You presently reside roughly a 3-minute commute from the zone's border, indicating that merely 3 brief minutes divide a $6 million residence featuring an indoor swimming pool from a fractured neighborhood where innumerable youths depend on state-sponsored academic meals for sustenance. He polished his spectacles for a subsequent time. Moreover, civic real estate tax documents definitively demonstrate that you declare a residence deduction in California for that dwelling in Hancock Park, practically decreasing your property tax invoice by roughly $7,000 each and every year, while you concurrently employ a distinct habitation categorization inside the District of Columbia regarding your high-end Washington apartment. That signifies 2 separate residences yielding 2 separate tax advantages across 2 separate regions. Senator Schiff is presently undergoing a severe probe regarding this precise double habitation tax structure, and I do not raise this to liken you to Senator Schiff, but instead because the trend of elite governmental entitlement is growing agonizingly apparent. Kennedy rested the document flat upon the desk. My buddy Boudreaux resides in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, where the overall populace fluctuates around 8,000 individuals. His unassuming dwelling is exactly 200 paces distant from his catfish enclosure, and he understands the precise exact tally because he enumerates those paces himself every single dawn. He strolls out the rear mesh portal, travels along the earthen trail, directly alongside the mature pecan tree, past the equipment structure, and straight to the liquid's boundary 200 paces. He nourishes the fish, carefully verifies the moisture levels, extracts the deceased ones, and subsequently he strolls 200 paces straight back toward his dwelling. Precipitation or clear skies during the freezing chill of January or the oppressive warmth of August, Boudreaux resides exactly beside his yield. His tone became more resolute. You reside in Hancock Park, merely a 3-minute commute from your impoverished zone. Yet you decline to journey those 3 minutes to witness the citizens you assist. Rather, you merely travel directly past them during your route to LAX, bound for Washington, D.C., or traveling to Minnesota to instruct the electorate of alternate lawmakers that they must become more confrontational on the avenues. Boudreaux strolls 200 paces every single dawn to ensure his fish are nourished, whereas you decline to stroll 200 paces to view the individuals who continuously vote you back into power. The faint chuckling that had previously permeated the space was utterly absent, substituted by a thick, suffocating quietness. Waters' attitude had severely changed. Her guarded smirk disappeared, substituted by firmly compressed lips. Her arm reflexively extended and rested upon her timber gavel without genuinely lifting it, merely making contact. It represented the involuntary maneuver of a dominant figure seeking to utilize her command to obliterate a menace, whilst being acutely conscious that striking the gavel at that moment would appear like a frantic capitulation. Madam Ranking Member, we shall advance and examine your offspring, Karen. Waters' mandible instantly clenched. Within legislative drama, referencing relatives indicates all standards of propriety are absent, and she comprehended precisely what was approaching. Based on federal archives, extending back to 2003, your authorized political organization, Citizens for Waters, has compensated your offspring, Karen Waters, and her advisory firm, Progressive Connections, a staggering $1.2 million, invoiced as charges for slate mailer management. That comprises $192,000 during the 2021 to 2022 campaign season alone, and the Federal Election Commission actually penalized your operation $68,000 lately for obvious infractions linked to this exact setup. He flipped another sheet. However, I am an inherently inquisitive individual, and I desired to discover exactly what $1.2 million in advisory charges actually purchases for an electoral effort. So I directed my research staff to extract the tangible, physical, printed documents. This is exactly what they uncovered. The correspondence that your offspring's expensively compensated business engineered and published in 2019 and the correspondence they published in 2023 are completely matching. They utilize the identical arrangement, the identical typeface, the identical edge illustrations, the identical phrasing, and the identical recommendation structure. The solely understandable distinction, the lone alteration executed over a 4-year time span that charged your contributors $88,000 in advisory fees, is that 3 particular applicant identities were exchanged. Literally everything else was merely duplicated and inserted. He stared squarely at Waters with an utterly inflexible gaze. $88,000 merely to access a digital document and input 3 fresh identities. My buddy Boudreaux's adolescent male performs that precise degree of digital labor in 15 minutes, and Boudreaux compensates him $50 per week, not $88,000. Kennedy grabbed his writing instrument and rapidly jotted a computation on his yellow tablet. $1,213,000 divided by $38,000 equates to 31.6. He elevated the yellow tablet so the lenses could record the basic mathematics. The typical industrious resident residing within your 43rd zone accumulates a yearly compensation of $38,000 annually, whereas your offspring has collected $1,213,000 via basic political distributions. That equates to 31.6 years of your voters' complete earnings, 31 consecutive years of rising early, battling horrendous congestion, registering in and registering out, solely to acquire what your offspring was given for distributing copied documents. He rested the tablet back upon the table. Boudreaux ships customized holiday greetings to a dozen of his tightest companions annually, utilizing exactly $7.20 value of postage labels. Factually speaking, Boudreaux's domestic postage endeavor possesses a vastly superior expenditure to impact proportion than your heavily funded political apparatus. Waters forcefully moved toward her audio receiver as 3.5 decades of directing legislative panels activated her urge to interject and assume command. This constitutes a total distortion of the way political funding. You are completely correct, Kennedy interrupted, his volume never escalating yet penetrating her exclamation like a colossal ice-breaking vessel carving through a solidified ocean. I ought to attempt to be significantly more precise for the official transcript. $1,213,000, and I earnestly express regret for underestimating the figure. Waters stalled, allowing her phrase to suspend in the silent atmosphere. Concluding her sentiment would entail openly validating that horribly precise statistic. $1 million represented a theoretical notion, yet $1,213,000 represented a terrifyingly exact sum, demonstrating Kennedy possessed all the evidence. For the initial instance in 35 years, the most vocal, most commanding female in the legislature had initiated a forceful phrase and discovered herself utterly incapable of concluding it. Kennedy calmly flipped another sheet as his document file became slimmer and the apprehension within the space expanded to a suffocating density. Let us contemplate 2008 and the catastrophic worldwide economic collapse when you individually executed a call to Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson to establish a confidential, restricted gathering with the declared virtuous intention of acquiring urgent assistance for minority-operated financial institutions. Kennedy angled his visage leisurely. A highly virtuous objective indeed, except that when this restricted gathering genuinely occurred, merely one lone financial institution was represented within the space. One United Bank, a fiscal organization situated completely up in Boston, Massachusetts, approximately 3,000 miles away from the citizens agonizing in South Central Los Angeles. Now, by chance, your spouse, Sidney Williams, happened to occupy a seat on the leadership committee for One United Bank, and he individually possessed roughly $350,000 of the institution's shares. If One United collapsed, his individual fortunes would have been obliterated entirely. He recited straight from the record. Subsequent to your individual meddling, One United acquired $12 million in national TARP capital, which represents citizen capital rescue currency supplied by the laborers of the United States. At the precise moment they accepted that massive relief bundle, national overseers had assigned the institution an evaluation of less than satisfactory. Converted into common everyday speech that is comparable to an educator assigning a pupil a D-, and the House Ethics Committee ultimately indicted you with 3 severe infractions of legislative regulations connected directly to this obvious conflict of interest. He halted, allowing the tension to mount. Yet the allegations were eventually dismissed, although they were not thrown out, because the foundational realities genuinely established your blamelessness. Negative. They were merely abandoned because the attorneys directing the inquiry for the panel were officially penalized for malfeasance throughout the probe, indicating the individuals retained to examine your malfeasance required a malfeasance examination of their own. It constituted an unbelievable stroke of fortune, and your personal grandchild, operating as your primary director, received an official notice of admonishment. Kennedy progressed to the last sheets. However, this represents the most troubling portion of the tale, the segment the press seldom highlights. What genuinely occurred to those $12 million of citizen capital? Merely 3 brief months subsequent to receiving those urgent federal rescue capitals, the FDIC determined that One United's top executive, Kevin Cohey, the identical individual whose floundering institution you contacted the Treasury Agency to rescue, had been flagrantly utilizing the institution's capital to bankroll his own luxurious private existence. He purchased a premium Porsche Cayenne and continued executing massive rental remittances on a breathtaking coastal apartment in Santa Monica. Institutional capital, taxpayer-financed TARP capital. Your individual communication to the Treasury generated $12 million, and 90 days subsequently, a portion of those $12 million were executing monthly lease remittances on a premium German utility vehicle and a seaside residence. He placed the document down. Subsequently, in 2010, merely 2 brief years after you obtained that colossal rescue, the FDIC formally released a halt and desist directive concerning One United, and the institution you battled so fiercely to rescue failed to even persist. $12 million of citizen capital from the United States was directed straight into a floundering institution possessing a D- evaluation, whereas the chief executive departed in a fresh Porsche. The institution crumbled. All that capital disappeared into a dark abyss, and completely nothing of worth emerged from the alternative side. Down in Louisiana, Boudreaux terms that a draining pond, yet up here in the capital, I term it $12 million that inexplicably evaporated into nothingness, with the sole individuals who apparently profited being the unethical executive inside his premium automobile and your spouse safeguarding his insulated stock collection. Kennedy aimed a frigid gaze at Waters. Boudreaux maintains a modest financial registry over at the Tesh Federal Credit Union in Breaux Bridge, and his present sum is precisely $4,712, which signifies his total life reserves. If Boudreaux lifted his receiver the following day, contacted the U.S. Treasury Secretary and stated, "Mr. Secretary, my financial ledger merely contains $4,000, and I am terrified of forfeiting it. Could you kindly coordinate a confidential federal gathering for me to acquire a rescue?" Are you aware exactly what would ensue? He polished his spectacles a concluding time. The Treasury Secretary would instantly terminate the call, and the very following dawn, heavily equipped FBI operatives would strike Boudreaux's primary entry to inquire of a catfish cultivator why he was pestering the national government. Kennedy continued. $350,000 in private shares purchases you a loan communication to the Treasury, securing you a rapid confidential gathering, and your spouse's institution promptly acquires $12 million. Conversely, an individual possessing $4,000 to his identity contacts the Treasury and gets disconnected and scrutinized by national operatives. The singular quantifiable disparity between those two communications is a six-figure stock collection and an influential position on a legislative panel. Madam Ranking Member, this does not represent a just and equitable United States financial structure. This represents a profoundly rooted United States caste system. Waters finally detonated, the barrier rupturing with hostile power. This one united issue was completely and exhaustively scrutinized, and I was entirely exonerated by the ethics panel. You were exonerated. Kennedy shot back immediately, equaling her fervor, yet maintaining his tone flawlessly regulated by an ethics panel whose very own primary investigative attorneys were literally penalized for extreme malfeasance throughout the duration of your probe. That does not imply you were exonerated, Madam Ranking Member. That merely implies you became extraordinarily fortunate and a colossal legal and moral discrepancy exists. Being exonerated implies the solid evidence incontrovertibly established your complete blamelessness, whereas becoming fortunate simply implies the law enforcement pursuing your transgressions were captured, violating the protocols prior to them being able to conclude the task. Waters fiercely slammed her palm downward upon the massive timber table. The acute snap reverberated throughout room 2128, resembling a firearm discharge. It represented the frantic bodily response of a lawmaker who had entirely exhausted her spoken weaponry and was reverting to crude physical might. "Reclaiming my time," she roared, unleashing her notorious trademark phrase. These constituted the identical three terms that had been transformed into widely circulated digital images, stamped onto campaign paraphernalia, adapted into musical tracks, and solidified as a hallmark cultural occurrence of her political journey. It was the pronouncement that flawlessly summarized Maxine Waters' style of unyielding dominance. She hurled it out into the chamber resembling a massive weight, and it snagged on completely nothing. Because Senator Kennedy was not a peer panel participant engaging in a discussion, he was functioning as a summoned testifier supplying evidence. The procedural guideline of reclaiming my time is solely utilized when a legislator has momentarily transferred their assigned speaking duration to another person and desires it returned. Kennedy had not been granted time. He was comprehensively and straightly responding to a distinct, antagonistic query that Waters herself had tossed toward him throughout her introductory tirade. He was delivering the precise, relevant data she had derisively requested. Lawfully and administratively, she possessed completely zero duration to retrieve. The primary panel attorney, an experienced aide who had diligently navigated disorganized sessions for upwards of a decade without ever acquiring a bit of pleasure from openly rectifying an influential ranking official, leisurely inclined toward his audio receiver. Madam Ranking Member, he pronounced tranquilly, his tone reverberating in the complete quietness. The testifier is presently answering your prior series of inquiries, and per panel regulations, the duration presently pertains to the testifier. Waters realized he was completely correct, and the remainder of the panel realized he was correct. Furthermore, the overflowing crowd realized he was correct. For the very initial occasion throughout Maxine Waters' heavily broadcasted 35-year journey in Washington, her premier armament was utterly incapacitated. Reclaiming my time was not merely disputed. It was administratively and openly rejected, relying on the rigid regulations of the very structure she had commanded for decades. A gentle ripple of chuckling flowed across the viewing area, yet this was not the warm, rustic entertainment that had accompanied Kennedy's Boudreaux narratives. This constituted a completely distinct and immensely more harmful reaction. It represented the derisive chuckling of a crowd observing a legislative titan's favored armament completely backfire within her personal grip. Maxine Waters had devoted her existence to obtaining mutual laughter, and she had never, ever served as the focus of targeted mocking. It signaled a degrading ideological transition, making the warmth within the space to crash, while Kennedy seamlessly shut his manila file. He moved it to the side and removed his reading spectacles, although this instance he did not polish them. He merely rested them upon the desk, presenting the somber motion of an individual transitioning from debating a topic to issuing an ultimate, condemning judgment. "I shall not narrate an additional amusing tale currently," Kennedy stated quietly, causing the atmosphere to transition once more. This mirrored the exact inflection Kennedy had utilized during the most crucial state defense updates. The rural appeal disappeared instantly, leaving solely the frigid, uncompromising recitation of a man listing indisputable truths concerning institutional community breakdown. "Madam Ranking Member, you have advocated for the citizens of California's 43rd Congressional District for 33 consecutive years, having been initially inaugurated into power all the way back in 1991. 33 years. The majority of contemporary matrimonies fail to endure that duration, and the majority of professional trajectories fail to extend that long. 33 years is ample duration to rear a child from the very second they are delivered until the date they achieve a doctorate. And it is unquestionably sufficient duration to take a fractured, impoverished legislative zone and completely reconstruct it into a neighborhood that flourishes and succeeds." He halted, allowing the burden of the decades to penetrate. Or conversely, it is precisely sufficient duration to remain idle and execute absolutely nothing while that zone splinters and deteriorates further. Way back in 1991, the calendar year you were initially chosen to rescue them, the formal impoverishment metric in your zone rested at 25%. Currently, in 2025, subsequent to 3 decades of your guidance, the impoverishment metric rests at 27%. Beneath your immediate supervision, impoverishment within your neighborhood ascended instead of dropped, growing by 2 entire percentage units across 30 years. Madam, this does not represent financial plateauing. This represents a catastrophic generational decay. He swept his stare across the visages of the fellow panel participants. Yet allow me to provide you the metric that genuinely counts. Way back in 1991, your particular zone placed 184th among all 435 legislative zones regarding impoverishment, indicating there existed 251 regions in the United States that were substantially more destitute than yours. Presently, your zone places 412th. Currently, there exist merely 23 zones across the entire United States of America that are more destitute than the one you advocate for. And this catastrophic plummet did not occur because the nationwide economy crashed, because comprehensively impoverishment metrics throughout the nation genuinely ameliorated. It occurred because 228 alternate legislative zones that formerly were substantially more destitute than yours genuinely improved. Their officials constructed systems, fiercely drew fresh commercial enterprises, battled to decrease aggressive offenses, and heavily subsidized their regional educational institutions and economical residences. Yet your zone executed absolutely zero of those actions. Across 33 years, 228 zones raced straight past yours, resembling swift automobiles speeding past a disabled, forsaken transport resting on the shoulder of an empty freeway. He concentrated his focus completely back upon Waters, yet you certainly did not disable, did you? It was not structured as a query. It was presented as a crushing factual dismantling. Way back in 1991, you were acquiring a standard national workers' compensation of approximately $174,000 annually. Presently, you individually possess an astounding $6 million estate in Hancock Park. You manage an additional $1.1 million throughout varied alternate property assets, and you keep a private shared vacation property out in Palm Springs because apparently a $6 million property necessitates a holiday escape. Your offspring's advisory business has drained $1.2 million directly out of your electoral contributors, and your spouse possessed $350,000 in private institutional shares that was incredibly saved by $12 million of United States citizen capital, whilst your personal grandchild rests securely on a national payroll, functioning as your primary director. The tone of Senator Kennedy reverberated throughout the absolute quietness. Your electorate consistently grew more destitute, whereas you consistently grew wealthier across 33 consecutive years. The financial arc of your susceptible zone aimed straight downward into the soil, whereas your personal portfolios aimed straight upward into the heavens. The nauseating chasm between those trajectories, the colossal, expanding gorge, dividing the manner your citizens are compelled to exist from the manner you decide to exist, merely expanded larger every single annum. Kennedy decreased his volume. My buddy Boudreaux possesses a phrase for this precise occurrence, deeming it reverse fishing. Reverse fishing constitutes what happens when you avariciously extract aquatic life from the communal enclosure rather than inserting them inside. The enclosure becomes progressively vacant, yet the angler becomes progressively plump. The individual retained to replenish the liquids is covertly consuming the stock for their personal benefit. He halted. During April 2021, you boarded an aircraft and traveled to Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, which does not represent your zone, region, or even your shoreline. Directly in the explosive center of the Derek Chauvin proceedings throughout an unbelievably strained era of demonstrations, you traveled 1,800 miles simply to command a gathering to become more confrontational. He gazed intensely at her. Legal defenders referenced your irresponsible remark to proclaim a corrupted trial, and the magistrate openly denounced it. The House of Representatives conducted a ballot to officially reprimand you, falling short by a narrow difference of 216 to 214. Following this turmoil, you entered a premium cabin flight and traveled straight back to Hancock Park. You securely withdrew to your $6 million estate concealed behind thick metallic barriers. Kennedy shoved the document file away. When Boudreaux's adjacent resident endured a catastrophic dwelling inferno in 2019, Boudreaux did not journey to a different region to deliver a theatrical address. He sprinted across his property, seized the widest botanical tube he possessed, and instantly commenced extinguishing the blaze. He severely scorched his palm on the blistering spout, yet disregarded it. The inferno was extinguished. The architectural soundness of the dwelling endured. Subsequently, Boudreaux strolled silently back, placed his scorched palm beneath chilly liquid, and drifted to slumber. That represents the core distinction between screaming, "Get more confrontational," and genuinely seizing the tube. A single tactic intentionally incinerates the dwelling, whereas the alternate actively attempts to extinguish the blaze. A single technique is transmitted from a secure span of 1,800 miles distant, whereas the alternate originates from an adjacent resident sprinting in the darkness. This leads us to the concluding point. The dwelling presently incinerating down to its base is your personal legislative zone, 33 years of guidance, 27% impoverishment. You utterly declined to spray the liquid upon your personal neighborhood. You redirected the liquid completely toward your personal dwelling. A $6 million estate irrigated your grass. $1.2 million channeled to your offspring irrigated your grass. $12 million acquired for One United Bank irrigated your spouse's fiscal grass. Concurrently, 161,000 agonizing citizens residing inside the 43rd zone, situated merely 3 minutes away from your massive defensive gates, yet an entire lifetime away from your indoor swimming facility, are frantically perishing from dehydration. He retrieved his spectacles and gripped them securely within his palm. Reverse fishing, Madam Ranking Member. Boudreaux nourishes the aquatic life, yet you consume the aquatic life. The quietness that ensued was complete. It was not the calculated quietness Waters typically utilized, because Maxine Waters shunned quietness. Her whole iconic trajectory was constructed upon the belligerent ideology that quietness equated to ideological capitulation, whereas peak volume equated to absolute triumph. Throughout 35 years of hostile panel sessions, impassioned chamber addresses, disorganized media briefings, broadcasted argument conflicts, and boisterous public forums, Maxine Waters had never previously allowed 10 moments to elapse without vociferously occupying the vacant atmosphere. 10 moments elapsed, and the lawmaker who was never silent throughout her entire existence was rendered completely mute. The representative whose resonant tone controlled every space she accessed permitted the oppressive quietness of shared suspended breathing to occupy the area entirely. This profound stillness was immensely louder and boundlessly more damaging than any address she could have delivered. It demonstrated that Maxine Waters, the most vocal liberal crusader inside the United States legislature, the female who fiercely retrieved duration as if she possessed the timepieces, possessed completely zero remaining to launch back. Any counterargument she attempted would solely worsen her predicament. Complaining regarding inequity would appear pathetic, originating from the possessor of a $6 million property, and claiming she assisted her voters would appear hollow against a 27% impoverishment indicator. Yelling her notorious statement anew would simply trigger an extra degrading spectacle. She stayed immobilized, her lips firmly sealed. For the primary occasion since she entered the Capitol in 1991, absolute dominance of the space resided with a different individual. The viral clips of the hearing triggered an unprecedented internet storm. Kennedy's catfish anecdote became the ultimate emblem of government waste, and reverse fishing entered the political dictionary, defining corrupt officials who amassed personal wealth while their districts suffered. The most damaging footage captured her famous catchphrase, failing. The 11-second video of her slamming the desk, shouting to reclaim her time, and being shut down by the committee lawyer gathered 52 million views in 4 days, proving her invincible armor had cracked. Her trademark battle cry transformed into a harsh joke, inspiring car stickers and an online campaign mocking her lack of procedural understanding. The reverse fishing metaphor did more than trend online. It rattled the governmental elite. This comparison, depicting a leader draining communal resources while the public starved, resonated with a cynical electorate, morphing into a precise accusation of deep-seated corruption. Capitalizing on surging public anger, a journalist launched an interactive tracking tool. This application mapped areas where lawmakers gathered private wealth while their constituents plunged into poverty. When compiled, she ranked an astounding 4th nationwide. The software's impact was instantaneous, generating 8 million unique visits during its first week, crashing servers, and dominating evening news broadcasts. Almost instantly, her protective barriers collapsed and official legal actions accelerated. The National Election Commission dramatically expanded its initial investigation into a massive 20-year forensic audit of her campaign spending. Investigators demanded original copies of every election mailer produced by her daughter's highly paid consulting firm to determine if these million-dollar duplicated assignments constituted a coordinated pattern of systemic electoral fraud designed to enrich her inner circle. Concurrently, a Federal Efficiency Bureau launched an aggressive probe into the infamous bank rescue operation. Agents verified the darkest suspicions. The collapsed bank's leader had shamelessly diverted taxpayer money to finance extravagant personal expenses. The presidential administration vigorously demanded a microscopic accounting to discover exactly where the missing $12 million had ultimately vanished. The controversy reached global attention when Elon Musk fiercely broadcasted the dispute to his massive digital audience, cementing it in daily virtual conversations. Prompted by this intense spotlight, the Internal Revenue Service systematically opened an exhaustive dossier on the family's consulting business, initiating covert scrutiny into potential tax evasion. California tax agencies simultaneously launched a rigorous probe into her dubious dual residency claims. Within 6 short months, 4 massive government investigations locked relentlessly onto her. The final crushing blow arrived when the Justice Department confirmed a preliminary criminal probe. Stripped of her political shield, she was forced to face unyielding federal agents. Sensing this vulnerability, formidable electoral challengers rapidly emerged, weaponizing the catchphrases born from that disastrous hearing to dismantle her local support. In a twist of historical irony, a lone senator from Louisiana successfully utilized a humble catfish breeder to methodically take down a seemingly invincible political dynasty. The success of these high-stakes probes hinges on an awakened public refusing to overlook past sins. The basin remains empty while Boudreaux observes it all.